Welcome. Happy New Year. Good evening. This is our inaugural event of the 26 speaker series. This is an extraordinary capacity crowd, and Ted, it's very much a tribute to you, to I think the issues we're going to be discussing, that the folks are here tonight. This is going to be a fascinating evening. Welcome to Rice University and to the Baker Institute. I'm David Satterfield, the director of the Institute. I'm pleased to host the conversation tonight with Ted Deutch. I could not be happier to have him here. I couldn't be happier to have the AJC represented here this evening. We're going to be talking about several critical issues, critical for the world, critical for the United States. Anti-Semitism here at home and abroad, the complexities of the Middle East, including U.S. policy in the Middle East. This moment, which reflects both opportunity as well as very significant challenge, and it's hard from hour to hour to always discern whether the opportunities exceed the challenges in scope as you run the calculus. All of them have important implications for the United States, for our friends and allies around the world, for the state of Israel, and for the Jewish community. There's an intense debate going on every possible issue right now, here and abroad. And so we try here at the Institute, and this evening I hope is an example of this, to clarify in a fashion which is ordered, structured, calm, as fact-based, and as nonpartisan as we can make it, what the issues are and how best they can be addressed. They're not abstract questions. They affect global stability, they affect U.S. national interests, they carry real consequences for millions of people. We're especially fortunate, as I've said, to be joined by Ted Deutch. Ted is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Jewish Committee, a role he assumed in the beginning of October 2022. Before leading the AJC, Ted served more than 12 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Florida's 19th, 21st, and 22nd congressional districts as a Democrat between 2010 and 2022. During his time in Congress, he served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the House Judiciary Committee. From January 2019 until your resignation in September 22, you chaired the House Ethics Committee. That's an interesting concept. I'm thinking of all those words: the House, ethics, committee membership. You also led the subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, Global Counterterrorism on the Foreign Affairs Committee. You were, and I think you remain, widely respected on both sides of the partisan aisle for your leadership on foreign policy and national security issues. What makes you such a compelling voice now is not only your policy background, but your ability in this role to bridge diplomacy, domestic politics, and moral responsibility and accountability, an increasingly valuable skill set, albeit challenged in today's environment. As I said at the opening, tonight we're going to take a look at the rise, I think the better phrase would be the reinvigoration of anti-Semitism and its implications for our society. I'll note for those of you who have not been following the news that the oldest and largest synagogue in Mississippi, in Jackson, Beth Israel, was burned as an act of arson, now validated as such earlier today. And the role of the United States in navigating a region, the Middle East, marked by, as I put it, both deep and significant challenges, but also opportunities. Since the horrific events that took place 2 years ago on October 7th, we have seen a global and domestic rise of anti-Semitic violence, anti-Semitic rhetoric. It is not an abstract phenomenon. Look, anti-Semitism, and we'll talk about this, is never wholly gone. It is one of the most ancient and aged of hates. At best, it's dormant, waiting to wake at moments of crisis, at moments of upheaval. Confronting that reality, clearly consistency and without equivocation, is essential for any civilized society, any moral society. The AJC plays a critical role in that effort, working with governments, civil society, international partners to counter hatred, defend democratic value, and promote dialogue and understanding across borders. And Ted, under your leadership, that work has taken on renewed urgency and global relevance. Now, I indulge in my repeated praise only because I, for 40 years or more, have worked with the AJC in Washington, overseas. It's an extraordinary institution. It is a credit to the United States. And frankly, Ted, a lot of it now, in this challenging period, is in your hands. The leadership has never been more important. With that, welcome to Rice. So let me start by asking you, as my old friend Dennis Ross would have said, give us a little context. What's the role, the mission of the AJC?
First of all, thank you very much, Ambassador. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks, everyone, for joining. This is a great crowd. I'm thrilled to be engaging in this conversation with you. What you left out of that very generous introduction were the multiple opportunities that we had to engage in conversation like this with I as chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee, and you primarily in those days as the Assistant Secretary for the Middle East.
I tried to blank out so much of those appearances.
I thought you acquitted yourself quite well, and we would have had you back even if we didn't have to in your official capacity. I appreciate it. AJC, American Jewish Committee, is an organization that has been around now for just about 120 years. It is an organization that engages with leaders in education and business, government and diplomacy, especially civil society leaders, interfaith partners, to create a world where Jews thrive, a world where Israel is fully accepted among the community of nations, and a world that recognizes that in both cases, the importance of democracy and democratic values are at the fore. And that means that at this moment, certainly since October 7th, there's been an enormous focus on what we do with the rising challenges of anti-Semitism around the world. The images from Jackson, the attack on Jackson, I note for everyone, just to connect the dots here, we're a global organization. We have 40 offices around the world, 25 in the United States, 15 around the rest of the world. And it takes us around the world advocating for the community. And it was just a few months ago that I stood in Melbourne, Australia, in a synagogue that was firebombed, in that case by Iranian agents.
Yes.
And fast forward now to today, the early part of 2026, when we've seen the same arson attack directed against the Jewish community and a Jewish institution. In many ways, this is what we've been battling now for. Anti-Semitism is not new, but what we've seen since October 7th is this resurgence both on the extreme left and on the extreme right. It has been an enormous challenge for us. But in the work that we do, I'll just finish with this, Ambassador, in the work that we do around the world, we both tackle the challenges that our community is facing, even as we recognize the opportunities that are ahead. And primarily right now, this synagogue attack is yet one more example where we would tell the leaders that we engage with, as I will tell all of you, that what this will lead to in recognizing that an attack on the Jewish community in Jackson, which may seem completely removed from Houston, less so from Houston, I suppose, than from the Jewish community in Chicago or Los Angeles or London or Paris. But we live in a moment where the community feels these types of attacks as attacks against all of us. And the reaction to this will be certainly twofold. And we've seen this before. There will be statements against this attack, decrying this attack, and there will be calls for more security at Jewish institutions. The fact is, while we support those efforts to increase security, the point that we constantly make at moments like this is that we want the community to understand, the broader community to understand, that it is not normal for any group to feel the need to have guards, armed guards, checkpoints, cruiser cars, SWAT teams standing outside, forcing the community to maneuver their way through all of these various checkpoints just to gather together, to pray, to celebrate, to be a community. That's not normal, and it's not normal for anyone in the community. And what we want right now is for the rest of the world to understand that when any group finds itself in that situation, we are all worse off. Anti-Semitism, I'll finish with this, it never stops with the Jewish community. Our history shows us that. Our democracy is at risk when any group is singled out. That has been true throughout the history of our country. It's been true across the world. Excuse me. Our efforts at AJC focus on helping the world understand that it is in everyone's interest to stand together in support of those democratic values in the fight against anti-Semitism, and recognizing that opportunities that will come as we stand together in those battles.
Great. Thanks, Ted. Let me ask you to take yourself back. It's very hard, it is for me, to October 6,
Yep.
2023. As you looked at the U.S., the world,
Yep.
and the Middle East, what were the critical issues you were focused on? What were your hopes, and what did you see as the challenges then?
Well, it's actually not hard for me at all, because on October 6th, 2023, I had an AJC delegation in Abu Dhabi with Emiratis and Israelis and Americans celebrating the Abraham Accords, really focusing on how significant the changes were that we could embrace if, as it appeared at that moment, the changes that had started with the Abraham Accords would then expand more broadly into the region with the potential normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. It was an incredibly hopeful moment. It was a Friday night. We had a Shabbat dinner with different cultures and different religions. And it was just a few hours later that Hamas, understanding how close, and Iran, understanding how close this transformative moment was, launched the deadliest attack against Israel, against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. But we were very much focused then on how significant the changes in the region would be when Israel was fully integrated, when there was real movement to peace across the region, peace between Israel and the Palestinians, the opportunity for dramatic, positive, long-term change that, and I know we'll head into a conversation about this, but that then October 7th came with the goal of setting that back, which it did in the near term, but which I would argue 2 years later, in many ways, we're now in a position that has us closer to being able to achieve that than even in those days just before October 7th.
And just a word on the Saudis and October 6, 2023. The administration had been negotiating for years the terms of the bilateral content of an agreement with Saudi Arabia, which focused primarily on China and thwarting, blocking, mitigating Chinese influence in, presence in, platforming in Saudi Arabia, using the UAE as an unfortunate example of where China could go in a threatening fashion that we did not want to replicate with Saudi Arabia. We had been negotiating terms that would have assured the dollar as the strategic reserve currency for pricing of hydrocarbons into the future, as well as certain assurances with respect to hydrocarbon production, windows of production in the event of certain crises in the world, and an indigenous Saudi nuclear fuel cycle. Saudis rejected, we tried, I negotiated for 2.5 years, an accord based on the same principles that the UAE had entered into on this, the 123 agreement, the additional protocol. The Saudis rejected this, as have now just about everybody else. The UAE experience is sui generis, a gold standard, but it's out there glittering in gold alone. But instead, we negotiated the terms of a quite extraordinary, unprecedented U.S.-directed, not just ability to monitor, but U.S. physical presence throughout all aspects of the cycle and acquisition of the fuel when it was produced. That was concluded before October 7th, or largely concluded. But the Saudis wanted a security assurance from the United States in the form of a treaty-level commitment. Based on the unhappy experience of Iranian attacks on the Saudi oil fields Abqaiq, to which there had been no U.S. response, and a UAE experience in which there had been an Iranian strike via the Houthis, which had not been responded to. The Saudis wanted a commitment. To get that commitment approved by the Senate, something additional was needed. That additional thing was formal normalization with Israel. So I'm just outlining this because the usual perspective is the purpose of dealing with Saudi Arabia is to get normalization. That is a worthy, extraordinarily important goal, but it was the necessary element for what is a bilateral agreement. And that's a point, I think, Ted, that needs to be made. It is in U.S. interest, not just Israel's, to see these kinds of relationships established. But normalization with Israel, something Mohammed bin Salman was committed to, told us repeatedly, was not a problem for him. It was in Saudi's interest, it was in the region's interest to do for all the good and worthy achievements that had been going on behind the curtains, under the table with Israel, now could come out publicly. But it was also necessary for us to get these other provisions done. That was the case on October 6th. It remains the case for the United States. I would strongly argue all those elements today.
It does. It remains the case, and there are different pieces here. It's important to remember the Abraham Accords weren't agreements that were put in place between nations who were at war. It didn't represent a peace treaty.
Yeah.
Right. Likewise with the Saudis, there are relationships, but full normalization is the next step to creating a region that is more integrated, where both the capital, the technology, the know-how, the innovation across the region could contribute to benefiting one another, benefiting each other's countries. And from the United States, from America's perspective, of course, that's in our interest as well. It's the reason that we've been so supportive of moving forward with normalization with Saudi Arabia. And it's ultimately in the best interest of so many other countries around the world. We do work in India, and we've worked closely with the Indian government on the India-Middle East Economic Corridor and what it could look like with Israel a part of the region. Suddenly, the path from India through Saudi into Israel on into Europe offers a tremendous amount economically to the Indians. It's the same kind of conversations that we have with our friends in Europe and the EU, and what it would mean for the EU to, rather than look at individual relationships with each country in the Middle East, if it could actually treat the Middle East as a fully integrated region, why that would be of such great value. This is, of course, why, as you point out, why the United States was so supportive throughout as well.
And look, it's not just that Saudi normalization with Israel would be an important step. It is the critical tipping point step. The Saudis normalizing would send a message to essentially every other country in the region that hasn't done this yet.
And for us, I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of work in the interfaith space. Our Muslim Jewish Advisory Council works not just with the Muslim community in America, but around the world. we've worked extensively with the Indonesians. So if, for example, Saudi Arabia, the most important country in the Muslim world, certainly as the Saudis would explain it, Saudi Arabia normalizes with Israel. Suddenly, Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, has an easier time moving forward as well. It's the reason it's why we've invested so much there. Same thing with other countries in the region. That's what could come.
Now we come to the challenge. On October 6, what MBS required, Mohammed bin Salman, was a very minimal rhetorical commitment from the government of Israel, and you could debate, draft different phraseology here, but essentially committed to the process of negotiations with the Palestinians for a lasting, just, and secure peace or settlement. Words to that effect. Whether that actually took place or not, or produced an outcome or not, was of secondary importance simply to the need for the rhetorical commitment that MBS could use with his own people, use with the region. October 7th changed all of that, changed it radically. While it is not clear entirely what MBS's requirements now would be, it is significantly greater in terms of substance, not just rhetoric, I believe, in terms of commitments that would be needed. Would it be needed with a different government in Israel at quite that level, with a different prime minister? And they're two different things. Can't say. But we are now in a position where MBS has reaffirmed consistently, I support normalization. Never backed away from it, never retreated. But what I require for my own purposes to be able to remain in governance and for broader regional perception is significantly greater than would have been the case on October 6th. It's an opportunity, certainly, Ted. It's a challenge as well.
Sure. Well, look, after October 7th, certainly within Israel, the debate was over. There was the idea that immediately after October 7th, there was suddenly going to be some deal where there's a creation of a Palestinian state. That would have been seen as a gift to Hamas for the atrocities that Hamas committed on October 7th. And so that idea was at the moment was taken off the table, which is why the efforts that still acknowledge, as AJC does, that ultimately finding a long-term solution that acknowledges that the Jewish state of Israel isn't going anywhere, and that it equally acknowledges that the Palestinians living in the region are not going anywhere. That there has to be a way to build long-term institutions, respect, that will lead to something that the Crown Prince would be sufficient for the Crown Prince to move forward. That continues to be the case. It's why those of us who believe that thought that the efforts by some countries in Europe and Australia and Canada to simply declare a Palestinian state actually set back the efforts of reaching a positive outcome, because it wasn't realistic, because it didn't acknowledge the steps that needed to be taken to bring everyone aboard to get.
And quite frankly, there was a bipartisan presidential consensus on that. The Biden administration saw that as absolutely unhelpful, unuseful. Before October 7th, after October 7th, this administration has been very clear on the points as well. It requires direct negotiations, not some form of international jump to a predetermined outcome or an international hand in what ultimately happens. So as again, we look at the consequences of October 7th, and this ties into the issue of anti-Semitism, there has been a confabulation of this government of Israel, Israeli policy, activities in Gaza, and the Jewish community, the Jews around the world. How do you deal with this?
There has been. I've not used in all of these conversations. I've not used the word confabulation, but I do think that that's appropriate. look, when you take the position, let's make a few observations at the start. Everyone acknowledges that what happened on October 7th was horrific. But for those who and we knew this would come, as on October 7th, we said that just as there are those who deny the existence of the Holocaust and the slaughter of 6 million Jews, that there would come a moment that notwithstanding all of the evidence that we have from the GoPro cameras that Hamas terrorists utilized to document what happened, that people would deny that October 7th ever happened. It did. That came. And those, in many instances, protesters in America who maintain that, they're not, first of all, they're not serious. It's not, it belies the actual truth of what happened. Leave them aside. The overwhelming majority of people in the world acknowledge what happened on October 7th was a horrific atrocity, and that Hamas not only should be condemned, but that Israel had a right to respond. There's also a realization that Hamas has some responsibility for what happened, not only leading up to, not only what happened on October 7th, but what happened after. And that by being clear, and we don't have to guess because we saw these statements consistently from Hamas leadership, that by being clear that driving up the civilian death count is something that actually would help Hamas in a PR battle, that's something that as difficult as it is for us to imagine, we also had to acknowledge was taking place. And so there was an important recognition there as well that Hamas was only too happy to see massive civilian casualties as their leaders went underground into the tunnels and they forced the Hamas civilians to be above ground. We also, I think, can acknowledge that the footage from Gaza was incredibly difficult to see, and that it's not mutually exclusive. That you can be appalled by what happened on October 7th. That Hamas is to blame. That Israel absolutely has a right to defend itself, just as any other country would, and also to acknowledge that the loss of civilian life is something that we all mourn. But what's happened, to your question, Ambassador, is the complexity of this for those whose goal is not to advance Palestinian interests, but is to undermine support for Israel. What we've seen is this effort to, by accusing Israel of committing genocide, for example, something that not only isn't true, but it removes complexity from the debate, and it makes the entire Jewish community around the world a defendant. That's been the effort here. That the idea that somehow you accuse Israel of being a Nazi state, you accuse Israel of the most horrific crimes, whether accurate or not, then that leads to the Jewish community then being blamed for anything that these accusations have led to. And the result is this massive increase in anti-Semitism. There's not another diaspora community that faces the kind of attacks. There's not another religious group that faces the kind of attacks that the Jewish community has because of longstanding anti-Semitism and the efforts to bring the Jewish community, hold the Jewish community responsible for what they mischaracterize the actions of Israel for doing. I'll just give you a few examples. There aren't protests outside of Chinese restaurants for Chinese atrocities against the Uyghurs. There aren't protests at Orthodox churches by those who are critical of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In neither of those instances are those applicable to what Israel actually did in defending itself in a war that Hamas started. The point is, however, what's transpired over the past 2 years is this massive effort to not only delegitimize Israel, to suggest that the only state in the world, the only nation in the world that has no right to exist is the one Jewish state, and to say that if you if you are a supporter of Israel, which the vast majority of Jews in the world are, particularly in the United States, then somehow you're responsible and you are then the subject of protests, of violence, and of attacks against your institutions. That's been the battle that we've been waging now for over 2 years.
And it's a very difficult battle. And again, I'll try to take it out of a partisan or specific administration context. The accusation of genocide. This is something that I, in my previous capacity, the administration, the Biden administration, had to deal with. And when we said, as we did flatly, this is not genocide, there are significant problems with the conduct of individual Israeli forces, discipline, structural issues there, which need to be addressed. That's a different issue. Genocide is the crime of crimes. It was established with a definition in 1948 after the war. After the Holocaust. Exactly. There are very specific definitions of what it is and the critical requirement of intent. And just as we were absolutely confident, I remain confident today, that this was not genocide. There are other problems, all of which need over time to be addressed, significant ones. It wasn't genocide. This was a delegitimizing accusation, and the alacrity with which the accusation of genocide, both in terms of institutions and individuals, had very little to do with the Palestinians or Gaza, and very much to do with delegitimization of the state.
Right, and it's the reason that almost from the moment that the case was brought at the International Court of Justice, that this drumbeat started and continued. It's the reason that the talking point that, well, the ICJ has determined that Israel committed genocide, which is flat out false.
The drumbeat, Ted, started at the ICJ before a charge was ever brought.
Well, that's true, which was the problem with the ICJ's efforts to begin with. But the actual position we find ourselves in, where commentators continue to say, well, the ICJ has found that
or
Israel
Albanese, the special rapporteur.
Well, the special rapporteur is the only thing that makes her special is her special hatred of Israel and the Jewish people. I would argue, but it's clear. Look, this is. As you said, when you take this is actually what's so nefarious about this. When you take the one country in the world that was created out of the ashes of the Holocaust, in the modern state of Israel, which is also, it's important to note, I would point out, the single best example of what it looks like when a native population returns to its homeland and casts off, in this case, the colonial enterprise that governed the region. You ignore that. You take the connection of 3,000 years that the Jews have to Israel. You ignore that. You take the Holocaust, which so many of the people making these arguments deny to begin with, the murder of 6 million Jews, the attempted annihilation of the entire Jewish people, and then you take that and you turn it on its head. And so you accuse the Jewish state of committing the very act in which the entire Jewish people was nearly wiped off the face of the earth. Then the goal of that is to get people around the world to then say, well, this is all about the Jews. And just as we've seen, I don't want to give everyone a lecture on anti-Semitism, but for the first 1,000+ years, anti-Semitism was fundamentally about Jews as a religion. This is Jews killed Christ. This is blood libel. This is the Jews and the bubonic plague. It's all about Jews and Jewish religion. Then we shifted to, and the Nazis being the best example, Jews were then attacked for being a race. And it was the racial purity laws that the Nazis used. And it was no longer about Jews as a religion, but suddenly it was a race that was putting it in jeopardy, the Aryan race.
Judenrein.
Right.
Yes.
And now we find ourselves where it's the Jewish state that has now simply become the focus of anti-Semitism, that it is actually the Jewish state that is responsible for all of the evils of the world. First it was the religion, then it was our race, now it's our state. But it's all fundamentally tied to this thousands-year-old problem of scapegoating the Jews for whatever the ills in society happen to be. That's the most important thing that we continue to stress. There is this sense for people who have seen the kinds of attacks against the Jewish community that have taken place since October 7th to think that somehow this is a problem that just arose after the attacks on Israel of October 7th, when in fact this is thousands of years we've been enduring this. We can't allow everything that we've experienced to simply now become commonplace and acceptable.
And Ted, there's a corollary to this. The AJC has been outspoken publicly, formally, about extreme settler, hilltop youth violence against Palestinians. That is a growing and very significant stain on Israel, on the IDF. How do you deal with that issue?
Well, we've been clear that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. And it is important for us, it's important for the world to understand that. Look, it's important for the world to understand what that means in the context of the diversity in Israel, Jews and Arabs, Jews, using the language that so often enters this debate that is ignored when it comes to Israel. The fact that the majority of Israel is now technically people of color from the Arab world, Mizrahis who have moved to Israel. It's important to make all these points, and it's important for us to understand that the expectations that we have of Israel, and it's the reason why AJC has been clear that when it comes to democracy, that the democracy as set forth in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and the democracy that specifically is called out for all inhabitants of Israel, has to be respected. And it's the reason that we've been clear in saying that there has to be accountability when there are terrorist acts, no matter where independent actions come from that put at risk the ability of reaching peace.
Ted, I want to move, and we'll talk about a number of these because I have audience questions that will bring up the issues. Very difficult strategic issue, not just for AJC, but for the community and for all of us. You're a member of Congress. You are a member of the community. You are a member of an institution which is out there in the public space. What have been the changes as you perceive it in the view, broadly speaking, by Congress, the view of the Jewish community, including its newer generations, of Israel, of the kinds of challenges we're talking about?
Well, there is. It's an issue. This is an issue that we've been thinking about, grappling with since, as you point out, since my days in Congress. Our own data tells us, our own polling shows that the connection between the Jewish community and Israel continues to be strong, overwhelmingly within the Jewish community. There are generational issues. For AJC, it's the reason that we committed so much of our time and our resources, not just to dealing with leaders around the world, but to creating strong leaders within the community. We have Leaders from Tomorrow program for high school students. Our campus global board is comprised of remarkable student leaders from around the world. Our Access program, likewise, young leaders. We think it's important for them to understand what it looks like to grow up to become leaders together, and that also includes an understanding of Israel. The reason that AJC runs Project Interchange trips, which we have for decades, taking now thousands of leaders from around the world to Israel, is to help them understand how complex Israeli society is. This is not new. Whether it's young Jews that we're working with in AJC, or when I was a member of Congress, and I would invite my progressive colleagues to come to my office when I hosted progressive members of the Israeli left, often prompting comments on their way out the door. My colleagues, as they left, looking at me and saying, in the case of certain members of the Knesset who came through, I think that they're more progressive than I am. Right? It's this understanding that what we celebrate about Israel is the fact that it is a democracy. And as we've seen, even during these past 2 years and before, that democracy in Israel is incredibly vibrant, in some ways more expressive, one might say, even than the democracy in America. You see it in people turning out on the streets to protest. You see it in the way people engage with one another in Knesset. And when we help people understand, whether it's young Jews or members of the community, when we help people understand what that complexity looks like, the various views that exist within Israel, among Israeli Jews and among Israeli Arabs, suddenly there's a much better appreciation for what Israel represents in the region, not just as a partner to the United States, but as an ally to the United States, importantly, representing those democratic values in the region.
Ted, I'll sharpen, perhaps unfairly, my question. As the Holocaust, in terms of time, recedes further and further out of memory, out of immediate experience, out of visceral understanding, that you don't have to be taught about what happens, you know. As more and more transactional politics, and it's not just on the part of the U.S., it's globally, certainly in the West, begins to dictate. This is a challenge. This is a big, big challenge.
Yeah, well, let's talk. I appreciate that. Let's talk about what those transactions look like, because if we're first of all, at the end of the Holocaust, the Jews who moved to help build the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, could not have imagined what Tel Aviv looks like today. Could not have imagined the role that Israel plays on the global stage in creating innovation that has transformed industries around the world. Could not have imagined a defense industry that is now providing the systems that help defend the state of Germany. Could not have imagined any of that from a transactional standpoint. And I will absolutely maintain that support for Israel is so much more than a transactional one. But from a transactional standpoint, if you look at all of the countries in the world and which countries are innovating, which countries are creating, which countries are showing what that big, vibrant, sometimes difficult, sometimes messy democracy looks like. If you're looking for where you might want to invest in building a transactional relationship, there aren't a lot of other places in the world that you might want to invest more than you would want to invest in Israel. And I'll just tell you, the fact that 2 years after a war, a really challenging, I mean, for anyone who's been to Israel, who traveled there during the war, as I know some of us have, Israel's a country that relies for its military on service by its citizens and reservists getting called up time and time and time again. People leaving their jobs, leaving their families to defend their homeland, that in the midst of all of that, with all of those challenges, with soldiers falling on the battlefield, with all the separation, with hostages, which we haven't even talked about, 250 hostages being taken, and and for 2 years, hostages being held by Hamas, that through all of that, when it comes to a ranking of the happiest countries in the world, Israel finds itself near the top. Again, as a transactional matter, I mean, spend some time, if you've not been, spend some time in Tel Aviv. Spend some time in the tech industry, in and around the tech industry in Tel Aviv. Take a look at what's happening by this incredibly resilient people, even throughout an entire war. I think, again, it's so much more than a transactional relationship, but if that's the world we live in, I still feel pretty good that this is a country you'd want to invest in.
I'm going to turn to questions from the audience because they raise many of the issues we haven't talked about, but touch upon them. And I'll speak now about, first question I received. Has the Trump administration helped or hurt the situation of peacemaking in the Middle East? Easy one for you. For you, not for me.
Has the Trump administration helped or hurt? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yes.
The cause of peace.
Yes. Look.
Hey, diplomats are supposed to be the ones that give those kinds of answers.
I'm not in politics anymore. We've been very clear. HAC is a fiercely nonpartisan organization, and we've been clear that it's we have to, in order to maintain that nonpartisan status, we have to be clear in acknowledging whether it's Democrats or Republicans, whichever party is in office, whoever holds the White House, whoever holds Congress, when they do things, say things that are helpful, then we want to acknowledge it. If they do things and say things that we think are problematic, then we'll say the same thing. In the case of the Trump administration, as a former member of Congress, someone who, going back to when I was in the state Senate in 2007 and authored the first piece of legislation in the country to remove our state investments in countries who were helping Iran develop nuclear weapons. Also, by the way, companies who were helping Sudan commit genocide. The Iranian issue has always been a primary focus of mine. And administration after administration talked about being prepared, all options being on the table to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons. But this is the administration that actually carried through on that promise at a moment when the Iranians were closer than they've ever been to developing weapons. And as we look, we haven't talked about it, but as we look now at what's happening on the streets in Tehran and across Iran, and the crackdown on those protesters, now at least 600, probably potentially 10 times that many, who have been killed by the government, protesters taking to the streets to seek freedom. If we think about what Iran could do to distract if the United States hadn't acted and they were able to break out to a nuclear weapon, that was something that we were fully supportive of. Likewise, we were supportive of the Biden administration's both support for Israel and efforts to bring the hostages home, and successes in standing with Israel. And we've been supportive of the president's efforts. The 20-point peace plan that brought home all the remaining hostages is a significant opportunity, presents a significant opportunity to achieve peace. And we're doing everything we can to help ensure that that moves forward and is successful. And we were deeply appreciative of the president and his team for helping to achieve that. So again, it's not an either or. I mean, when there's something that's positive, we want to acknowledge it. We think it's critically important to do so.
You mentioned Iran. I've got 4 questions. This is not a speed round. Iran, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon. Let's start with Iran.
Yeah.
Ted, what do you think?
I think we need. I think we need to be clear what side we're on. I think we need to stand with the Iranian people. It is. I mean, this is a regime. It's interesting. This is a regime that has defined itself by its hatred of the United States and its hatred of Israel, right? Death to Israel, death to America. It's what we've heard over and over and over again. Every time there's some sort of protest movement, this is the result. This is a regime that has focused more on exporting revolution around the world than it has on supporting its own people. It is also important to note, and I say this as a former member of Congress whose constituent was the longest held American hostage in history, held by the Iranians, that has used hostage taking as just part of the way they conduct their statecraft. It's a terrible regime, brutal regime that violates the human rights of Iranians every single day. We have to be clear about that. We have to stand on the side of the protesters. And the president has engaged. I don't know what these talks will look like. As it sounds, the foreign minister is now either has had or is going to have a conversation with Witkoff. But I hope, and we've told the administration, first and foremost, we should never waver in whose side we're on here as this goes forward. And by the way, I just have to say, for all of the people who continue to march in the streets protesting in support of Hamas, but cannot find a word to say about a government that not only funds Hamas, but is currently slaughtering protesters in the streets, I just think that's a point that has to be made. Lebanon, that's Iran. Lebanon, we need Hezbollah we need the Lebanese armed forces to play a more significant role in disarming Hezbollah. We were hopeful. It's unclear if that's actually going to move forward. That's the threat. That's the concern to Israel. And I think the Israelis have made clear that if that doesn't happen and additional steps have to be taken, they're prepared to take them. On Turkey, Ambassador, you're the guy to answer that question. So I'm going to turn that back to you. And
thank you.
And Syria. On Syria, I think that the decision to recognize that there is some opportunity to negotiate a security agreement between Syria and Israel is significant, and I think it has to be pursued. And as the president's team is engaged around the region, and it's the same team. The challenge is that the Secretary of State and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are now trying to negotiate an end to the Russia-Ukraine war, and they're trying to make peace in the Middle East. In Gaza, they're trying to see if there's a deal to be made with the Syrians. They're on the ground in Lebanon. It makes it very challenging. I think that has to be pursued, and potentially the fly in the ointment in moving forward in a number of these areas is Turkey, Mr. Ambassador.
Sure. So I'll start with a discussion of Iran. We're going to have a discussion, a Baker briefing, focused on the question of Iran and the developments there later on this week. But let me offer some thoughts. You saw mass demonstrations in 2009 which were focused on electoral fraud and disenfranchisement of voters. In 2022, over the issue of women and freedom, over the murder in police custody of the young woman for lack of adequate hair covering. This is different. This is not about culture. It's not even really about the political system directly. It is about a regime whose corruption, whose dysfunction, whose pure bungling. I'm reminded very much of Talleyrand's attributed quote about the execution by Napoleon of the Duc d'Enghien, which was, "It's worse than a crime, it's a blunder." This is very opposite to the situation in Iran. No electricity, no water, a currency which is devaluing now at a spiraling pace.
Completely.
And so ability to feed not just the lowest classes, but now climbing up into upper middle class strata, everyone but the regime elites themselves. They're suffering. They're suffering across the board. What does the regime do? If it's cultural, you can relax the strictures of religious police and head covering and things like that. But if it's fundamental economics, where is your flexibility to respond? So long as you continue to fund the external proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas. What is one of the cries in the street right now? Not for Lebanon, not for Gaza, for Iran.
Yeah.
There's no mystery about where hundreds of millions of dollars go and have gone and continue to go. Second point is the sanctions. The sanctions have indeed had progressively a crippling effect on the Iranian economy, but that's a product of the nuclear enrichment program. I'm not surprised that the Omani foreign minister yesterday was in Tehran, or that we are now hearing, acknowledged by the White House, that there have been overtures made by Arakji to Steve Witkoff. If I were the Iranians, I would at least seek to buy time and space from a more rigorous administration response by holding out the possibility of negotiations. Now, Ayatollah Khomeini drank from the poison chalice, as he called it, in settling the Iraq-Iran war. Is this regime willing to drink or sip or at least examine more closely what they have described as another poison chalice, abandoning the enrichment program? I don't know, but I know they're in trouble. That's on the side of things that seem to be moving. On the other hand, we've seen no indication of fragmentation or division among any of the regime political or security services or elites. None to date. So they still possess powerful levers with which to fight. The problem is, this is about life and sustenance itself, not culture, not structures of governance. And the tools this bankrupt, literally, regime, moral, political, and economic have are very, very limited, except more force. So they suppress the demonstrations, if that's the case. When do they come back again? Because what can they offer except more of the same?
Right, but if the way they do that is to shut down the internet and to throttle down cell service so that this highly Western, highly plugged-in country cannot communicate with the outside, that can't continue. They're not going back to the Stone Age. Eventually, that's going to end. Eventually, there will be more satellite options, even as they try to block Starlink, and people will see what happens, what's happened, and they have the sole interest of maintaining power. But if they're bankrupt and they lose the shop owners, they lose the bazaris, then the only thing they have left is power. And no, there's no indication yet that they're willing to give that up. But that doesn't happen until the end. So,
and I would hold out here a couple, sad truths. First, absolutely signaling, as the international community almost universally has, that we are with the protesters in their rights to peacefully protest and to determine the course of their own country's destiny. Absolutely. But the more you suggest, particularly from the two, big Satan, little Satan, U.S. and Israel, something beyond that, you feed the regime's narrative. This is always about an attempt by the U.S. and Israel to subvert the revolution. There's a very careful line here. It's not easy. You want to support the demonstrators, but there is certain rhetoric which can so identify demonstrators, you think for the best of reasons, in a way that actually helps the regime. There's a counter argument. I have to offer the counter, which is this has gone beyond that point. It doesn't really matter what Israelis say or the Israeli government says. Doesn't matter what the U.S. says. This has a momentum of its own. But I note in the past, and a strike on Iran could profoundly affect this, rallying to nationalist causes is something regime has used always as a very potent tool.
But in the meantime, there's no one who can make the argument that the slaughter of innocent protesters is being carried out by Israelis or by Americans. It is very clear who's responsible for this, and when the lights go on and the internet comes back and people can start sending cell phone images, that's when things can accelerate very dramatically.
The other tough truth is, if the regime, this clerical regime, were to suffer an upheaval, most likely the security services would simply take direct control of the country. There's a classic patterning here. Does that then accelerate even further the protests, and where does it go? Where does it go? Mabad, as they say in the Middle East. Things might be bad right now, but Mabad, what after? What comes then? These are questions we can't settle. I merely note they're all out there. Syria. I think there is a significant challenge right now between Israel and the administration over policy in Syria. Israel, this government, wishes to see, it's very clear, a different kind of Syria than the president wants to see, for reasons of both purported security as well as long-term ability to operate. A fragmented, weak Syria is at least put forward as in Israel's interest. President has been increasingly clear, as has Steve Witkoff and Jared, they don't want to see that. They think that's a formula for generation of increased threat to Israel, to the region as a whole, and to the Gulf states. So not something that has a resolution right now, but it's not an area of common agreement. Lebanon, I wish I could forecast a happy ending to Lebanon, but I will mirror Tom Barak. Hezbollah will not voluntarily disarm. It is intrinsic to what Hezbollah is, to its identity. It disarms, and it's just another Shia-based political party competing for votes like every other Shia political party, Amal or anything else does. Its cachet of the resistance, of the gun, is something that is absolutely essential to its political survival in Lebanon. It won't do it voluntarily. What if Iran at least collapses or changes enough that there's no more money flowing? That will hurt Hezbollah, but I still don't assess, having spent the majority of the last half century working on this, will change Hezbollah. What can change it? There is no entity in the country of Lebanon that can take on Hezbollah. It would produce a civil war. Or worse, it would produce massive casualties and Hezbollah asserting itself as it did in West Beirut some years ago to demonstrate there's only one thing that can change this calculus, and that's Israel. And I think there is a certain expectation that a shoe or part of a shoe or something else will fall at some point to try to change Hezbollah's calculus. That's not a happy prospect at all. Not for Lebanon, not really for Israel or the region, but I'm afraid this is an immovable object right now, confronting what will ultimately be the irresistible need to address it.
Although Hezbollah has, I think we can agree, significantly less cachet after the war than it did on October 6th.
But it has enough power that if existentially challenged in Lebanon, it'll push back, whatever the consequences, which is a sad reality. I cannot bring myself to a more optimistic cast. But you know, that's just one problem. Lebanon has a whole nother problem, which has nothing to do with Israel and nothing to do with Hezbollah. It has to do with being Lebanese. And that is the inability of the Lebanese elites to agree to fundamental economic and banking sector reforms that would allow, even with an armed Hezbollah, the monies that are needed, the investments that are needed to flow. But that's not an Israeli issue. It's not even a Hezbollah issue. It's related to being a Lebanese elite. Good luck with that one. But Turkey.
Take us out of here with an upbeat take on Turkey.
Turkey.
Ambassador?
Look, Erdogan is two individuals within a single person. He is an ultimate and extraordinarily clever and agile political survivor. He is someone who has been able to strategically readjust his views, sometimes 180 degrees, as he did with interest rates and the Turkish economy when he realized his, to be polite, unique economic theories were bringing one of the 20 greatest economies on the face of the earth to its knees, not because of systemic problems or oil or COVID, but one individual's absolute control of economic policy and rather non-orthodox, he reveled in that term, non-orthodox economic views. He reversed himself and the economy recovered. That's the pragmatist. There is also the other Erdogan, who views himself as leader of the Muslim world. That is a claim met with derision in most of the Muslim world, but he genuinely believes it. He is the successor of Abdul Hamid II, the last of the non-reform sultans, the last reactionary sultan, not of Ataturk. He believes Turkey's identity is rooted in the empire. The empire represented the greatest expression. It's very similar rhetoric to that Putin used. Difference is Erdogan believes it. I don't think Putin does. That empire is the great rallying point, the genuine identity of these countries, truncated now geographically, politically, from the power they held once upon a time, in each case, prior to the First World War. It's a potent rallying point. It has a value for Erdogan, as it does for Putin, but ultimately it's juxtaposing these fantastical views with very pragmatic thinking and pragmatic views. When Erdogan erupts emotionally, as he has done repeatedly with respect to Israel, Shimon Peres's touch on the shoulder at Davos, President Biden's blood on his hands accusation, and the blood libel against Jews. Jews are only happy when they can drink blood, that Erdogan uttered shortly after October 7th. That emotional Erdogan is very difficult to deal with. Do I believe over the long term Turkey is a threat to Israel? No, I don't. I believe Turkey understands that from a practical standpoint, including economic, it needs relations with Israel. Where did most of those IDF reservists, after serving mandatory service, go? If not to the Maldives or Thailand, they went to Turkey. It was one of the greatest destinations in terms of numbers of Israelis, particularly young Israelis. Istanbul, Anatolia, that's where they were, the beaches, that's where they wanted to be. Turkey has hurt itself significantly, more than Israel has been hurt, by the cutoff in trade. Sooner or later, Erdogan will want a way back into all of this. Syria is the place where the play that has a strategic dimension between the two countries is meaningful. And Israel has acted preemptively to thwart or mitigate certain Turkish objectives. Will there ultimately be a new status quo between the two countries? Yes, I think there will. But boy, the emotions are awful high on both sides right now.
When I asked you for a positive take on Turkey, I didn't expect to get one.
I gave you over time.
I hope that you're right. I hope you're right. I don't know how much time we have. I want to make sure. I just want to make. I don't know if there are more questions. I want to just acknowledge, Ambassador, for you and the Baker Center. There are. First of all, I've really enjoyed this. It does. It does take me back to all of those conversations we had when we were both in our prior lives, which I always enjoyed enormously. And I say this. I think I knew of the Baker Center. I've had the pleasure of spending half a day here at Rice, and I think the Baker Center represents a real jewel here at Rice, and in putting putting this community in the center of so many of the really fundamentally important foreign policy issues that the world is currently grappling with. And I think that as the Baker Center goes about that really important work, they're really fortunate to have you as the leader of this effort.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. We've kept you all quite a while, but I'm going to offer the opportunity for 2 questions for issues that perhaps we didn't address already. Do we have them? Yes, sir.
Is there an opportunity for new leadership within like the Muslim community in any of these countries that you mentioned, in terms of just a different house view, different world view on the destiny for populations of these countries?
I'll take that first, and it's a positive answer, with one sterling exception, Tunisia, which has moved with ever-increasing vigor back into a miserable present and a very unhappy future for its own people, including embrace of ultra-nationalist, Arabist, classic rhetoric. And Algeria, which appears moored in some separate space, not unique for Algeria, but unfortunate given the potential there. With those 2 exceptions, and then the disaster of Yemen, one of the greatest humanitarian disasters by magnitude on the face of the earth today, in terms of any of the dimensions of the situation there, and not likely to get much better in the future. With those exceptions, the Middle East collectively and North Africa have moved steadily in a direction of acknowledgement of the practicalities of living in an interconnected region and an interconnected world, and that includes acceptance and acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the State of Israel, and beyond that, the positive value of Israel as a part of the region. And that, I think, is a fact that isn't going to be changed by what government is in charge in Israel or what happens ultimately in Gaza. It can certainly be accelerated or slowed by all of that, but it has its own reason unique to each of those countries, and you can see it, again, across the board, without exception, except for those unique 3 countries that I mentioned. But Ted, I'll turn to you.
I would just point to the 5-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords, and the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco as examples. The UAE, I think, is the best example for all of the challenges across the region during the war. The only country that continued, whose state airline continued to fly to Israel throughout the war was the Emirates. It wasn't United or Delta. It was from the Emirates, or American. I don't want to be I want to be an equal opportunity critic. And trade has continued, and it represents an example of exactly what the ambassador was talking about. There is this understanding that the path forward within individual countries across the Muslim world is one that will be strengthened, as evidenced in this case by the Abraham Accords countries, by working toward a more integrated region rather than withdrawing to a more nationalist position that separates themselves from the region. So I do think that that's a good example.
One more question. Out.
Yes, I'm very curious how you would address Jews who do not live in Israel, but who are vocally very upset with some of the policies of the Netanyahu government, and also spokesmen in Israel like Ben-Gvir and Smolich, who are speaking the kind of words that we thought we would not hear from Israelis. How do you feel that American Jews and Jews outside Israel, how should they present their position to Israel on these programs that I'm mentioning?
If we feel a close connection to the democratic state of Israel, as is the case for the vast majority of Jews. And we recognize the vibrant democracy, as we've discussed, the vibrant democracy that exists in Israel, and we appreciate the commitment to democracy as elaborated powerfully in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Then I think we have an obligation to say so and to say exactly what we think. And I in the case of individuals within the Israeli government, if they serve as ministers in the Israeli government and they say things that that should be criticized, then certainly we at AJC have not hesitated doing so. If we want people to understand the complexities of Israel, then we certainly should be in a position to acknowledge those and to speak out about them, not just by pointing out that it's a big country with lots of different views, but when there are statements made that rankle, when there are statements made that run counter to that Israel that we've discussed, then we say it out loud. And I think that's, as Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people, and for those of us who feel connected to it, we have a stake in the direction that Israel goes, and I think it's perfectly acceptable for us to say that and to take those positions.
I have to note, Ted, I get all of the AJC releases, the communiques. There have been many occasions when very disturbing things have happened in Israel, said or done. AJC issues a public statement. I don't see that from anybody else.
Yeah, and I thank you, Ambassador. And no one questions our commitment to the state of Israel, our advocacy for the state of Israel around the world. And in fact, I think it strengthens our position to be able to point to those occasions where we have put out statements that have been critical of some of the statements that we've seen coming from ministers within the Israeli government. I'll finish with this. As we think about the next few years, we've spent a lot of time focused on what's transpired during the war. But as we think about the next few years, we're going to be in a better position, those of us who care about Israel, to advocate for Israel, as we also acknowledge these complexities, we acknowledge the challenges, and that we be clear in our belief that the democratic state of Israel is not just a country that we support because of a religious connection or because of a historic connection or a cultural connection. It's a country we support because as American Jews, it's not only in our interest as Jews, but it's in our interest as Americans. And I think that's the way we need to be thinking about this as we go forward.
Great. Ted, thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thanks. Great. Thanks so much.